Welcome back. The topic for today is Muse Records. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of history on the label, but more importantly, I want to get into the music, and I'm going to do it sort of through three lenses. I'm going to cover sort of the most valuable records that are in the Muse catalog. I want to talk about some cheap heat or underrated albums, and then I just kind of want to finish by giving you just an array of other albums that I think are particularly strong. This label put out something like 300 or 400 albums over the course of its history, and so I just kind of want to direct your attention a little bit to some of the ones that I'm most excited about, even though I still think that the label overall is worth your exploration beyond these few recommendations that I have. So as always, if you haven't yet, please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you get notified every time I post a new video. And then you can follow me on Instagram if you'd like. I post pretty much every single day with a different record talking about sort of my thoughts, sometimes a review, sometimes, hey, here's just something I'm listening to. Anyway, my handle over there is what_can_brown. So I think something for everyone is probably the theme both of this video, because I'm covering, again, the history and the sort of the valuable records, but also the not as valuable records, and talking about the music. But something for everyone is also probably the theme for Muse Records, even as a label. And so let me kind of explain, and maybe I'll start sort of at the beginning. So the story of Muse Records begins with a guy named Joe Fields. So he was pretty much a career record label guy, even at the point that he started Muse. So his first job out of school was with Columbia Records. He was selling records like door to door to record stores in Brooklyn. He then later worked for London Records, I think, in sales as well. He ended up at like MGM and Verve. He worked at Sue, S-U-E, that label. He later became a sales manager at Prestige. And that he sort of parlayed that into joining Buddha Records with the help from Don Schlitten. So while he was with Buddha, Fields decided to start, I'm sure in partnership with the owners of Buddha, decided to start Cobblestone as sort of a Buddha subsidiary in 1972. I don't know the full history behind what exactly happened to Buddha, but I do know that starting a jazz label in 1972 was probably a risky proposition, because jazz was a little bit on its way out. And that sounds funny to think about in retrospect, right? Because of all the great music that came about in the 70s and how jazz shifted into funk and soul. Well, it was already in soul, but fusion and all these different things. But in any event, Buddha didn't feel like, Buddha ended up going under, regardless of whether it was because of Cobblestone or it was because of the rest of their catalog, because they kind of, they were in a broad array of genres. So anyway, Buddha quickly fell apart after Fields joined, and he decided to actually acquire the masters from Cobblestone, and he used that in part to start Muse Records around 1972. So Muse as a label was around and active from about 1972 into the mid-90s. I think technically like 1996, but they weren't really that prolific in terms of releasing new music in the mid-90s. During that time, though, over that almost 25-year period that Muse Records was around, which is long for a label to still be under the same ownership, so I think that's impressive. But over that period of time, Joe Fields apparently had enough success that he actually acquired Savoy Records in 1983, and then he later acquired Landmark Records, which he purchased from Orrin Keepnews as well. So this kind of shift from Cobblestone to Muse, I think, is interesting to a lot of collectors, because some of the titles that were originally put out on Cobblestone were very quickly reissued on Muse as soon as Muse was started. I mean, think about it. Joe Fields had the masters. He could do whatever he want. He also didn't really get that much of a chance, I think, to promote some of these albums under the Cobblestone label before it folded. And so it's possible that they didn't have, like, say, the right distribution. Maybe they still had a lot of stock left over. Like who knows? But in any event, some of the titles he decided to quickly reissue under Muse. So otherwise, what Fields did when he started Muse Records is he pulled in a few artists who had recorded for Prestige, so probably ones that he had some experience with or he knew were big sellers. And it seems to me like this was done with the agreement of Prestige. Like, I don't think some of these musicians were under strict contracts at that time with Prestige, because it was Prestige people who were helping Fields sort of get established. So it's kind of like kind of an interesting thing that they were helping him when you consider that these two labels might have actually been, you know, up against each other. So anyway, some of those artists that, that Fields pulled in over to Muse were James Moody, who actually recorded the very first album that was put out on Muse Records, but also Jimmy Rainey, Don Patterson, Cedar Walton, Sonny Stitt, Jackie Byard. Those were some of the first artists that were recorded for Muse Records. He also brought in artists who hadn't recorded as leaders before, or at least for the most part, they either got their first or one of their first opportunities to record as a leader on Muse. So Richard Davis is a good example. So he recorded The Philosophy of the Spiritual for Cobblestone, and then he recorded an album titled Epistrophe and Now's the Time for Muse almost like immediately after. The Roy Brooks album, The Free Slave, was Roy Brooks' first album as a leader since Beat came out in 1963. Kenny Barron's first album as a standalone leader anyway was Sunset to Dawn in 1973, followed by Peruvian Blue. I'm going to be showing you some of these, so yeah. I'd say overall, if the label though is known for any artists, even like over the course of its 25-year period, they'd probably be folks like Mark Murphy, Houston Person, Sonny Stitt, Etta Jones, Woody Shaw certainly, and Ricky Ford in terms of volume of titles. Now, I'm not necessarily going to be covering a lot of those musicians because I think folks who follow this channel know my preferences with music leans a little bit more into hard bop, post bop, spiritual. And so out of those musicians that I just mentioned, certainly Woody Shaw was both a well-recorded, heavily recorded artist, both as on his own albums as a leader, as well as supporting other musicians. But we're also going to be covering just a variety of other musicians, not as much the Houston Person, Sonny Stitt kind of stuff. So in terms of, I mentioned there's something for everyone on this label, and there is, and I just mentioned some of the artists that maybe I'm not as, that I'm not as much of fans of, or I don't have as much of their music because it's not really the style that I like. There really was a variety of styles on Muse. Initially it was soul jazz and sort of hard to post bop. But they'd end up putting out Latin stuff, a lot of fusion stuff, but like cool fusion stuff, not like syrupy fusion, if that makes sense. And I think that the point was not to pigeonhole themselves, but really produce enough albums that appealed to enough people so that there was something for everyone, but really all in the jazz space, or mostly in the jazz space. Much of the cover art for Muse, I think, was particularly inspired as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, it wasn't, it's not like Reed Miles kind of stuff, but a lot of it was done by a guy named Ron Warwell. He also did a lot of work for Milestone. So if you think about Gary Bartz's albums for Milestone, like Uhuru and Taifa and Juju Street Songs, he did all of those covers. He did Joe Henderson's Black is the Color. But that was for Milestone. For Muse, he did Lester Bowie's Fast Last. He did Pat Martino's Consciousness, Woody Shaw's The Moon Train, Joe Bonner's albums, I think a few of them. He did some stuff for like Dollar Brand and Catalyst. Again, I'm going to be showing you some of these covers here shortly. And then he ended up later doing stuff for Strata East. And then he did like Tarika Blues, self-titled album as well. So anyway, just a pretty prolific guy. He did a ton of covers. And I think that there is like sort of a signature, kind of, not physical signature, I'm saying like a stylistic signature that his work has that I think is particularly great for this type of music that Muse is putting out. All right, so what I want to get into are my favorite albums on the Muse label. I would say over time I've gotten deeper into the catalog, and I'm at the point now where I have, I would say, most of the copies of the titles that I was after. But the asterisk there is that the titles that I'm aware of, right? Because there's so much music on this label. I continually explore stuff, but out of the stuff that I'm aware of, pretty much have everything that I'm like most interested in. And I want to be clear also with this video, we're not covering Timeless Muse. So Timeless Muse was a partnership, I think in like 1979, between the Dutch Timeless label and Muse Records. So Muse was involved in that. Again, starting in like 1979, they put out a bunch of great titles. Don't get me wrong. In fact, a bunch of titles that I have, in any way that I could contain this video, I had to. So I'm not talking about that. I also don't just want to show you everything I own on Muse because that wouldn't be helpful in terms of directing you to what I think is especially great. So what I'm going to do, and I started out with this, I'm going to show you the 7 most valuable titles as far as I can tell. Then I want to show you 8 examples of like under the radar or like cheap heat kind of stuff. And then I actually pulled out like 14 other recommendations. So we're covering what's 15 plus 14 is 29. So that's a lot of titles. What I'm going to do is probably spend a little bit more time on those valuable titles in the cheap heat, and then I'm going to do a little bit more of a show and tell kind of thing where it's briefer for the rest of the stuff, just to get through it. But hopefully, if you're new to Muse or you know about Muse Records, but you're looking for, say, the next titles to go after, then hopefully this will give you a good place to start. All right, so let's start with what's probably the most valuable record in the Muse Records catalog, and perhaps rightly so. Although I think it's interesting that it's a live album. So the title in question is Roy Brooks's "The Free Slave." So I would say that this is one of the titles across all labels that took the most sort of stratospheric jump in value during the pandemic. This thing used to be like $30 like 5 years ago, and I've seen it go for like $400 now. Don't get me wrong, great album. So like I said, this is a live album. This is the third release ever for Muse, so it was very early in their catalog. On the album, in addition to Roy Brooks, who's on drums, you have Woody Shaw, and Woody Shaw is like, gosh, he just plays on so many titles on this for this label, and they're fantastic. He's always great. You also have George Coleman, Hugh Lawson, and Cecil McBee. This was recorded in 1970. So I personally think that this title is just a really great kind of merge of styles that sort of bridge the 60s and 70s sounds. It definitely has a rawness to it, I think, both because it's a live record, but also because of these sort of swirling post-bop sound that's achieved, I think mostly through Roy Brooks's percussion. There are expansive tracks here. I think the shortest one is, are there timestamps here? The shortest one is 9 minutes and 7 seconds. And the longest one is 13 minutes and 40 seconds. So there's a lot of time for solos. There's a lot of energy here, a lot of opportunity for these tracks to build. And like I said, I think that there's a lot of rawness that that is the relic of the 60s and maybe the early 70s, but very quickly Muse would get into a lot more, I would say, not smooth, but more fusion, more electric instruments, especially piano and bass. You do not get that here. But, and that's why I say this is almost like a little bit more of some of those stylistic elements from the 60s, but again, is this sort of connective tissue, I would say, between the decades. All right, the next one I want to talk about may actually be the second most valuable. I'm not exactly sure. And who knows? I'm just kind of saying generally these are the most valuable. So this one is Walt Barr's East Winds. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not the most attractive cover, and that's not a criticism of Walt Barr. I'm just saying, like, overall, I would call this curiously valuable. And why I say that is because it turns out that there's a track here, I think, that was sampled by Madlib. So the styles here are very different than what we just talked about with Roy Brooks. It's poppy, it's funk, it's even disco. It feels every bit of 1979, which was its release date. I was actually not familiar with the lineup here, but it includes Bill Kuhn on bass, Mark Leon on drums, Jack LeCompte on percussion, Steve Haberman on piano, Roy Braverman on synthesizer, and then of course Walt Barr on guitar. This is one to go after because of that sample, I suppose, but overall for me this is a little bit uneven. I actually like Walt Barr's first album for Muse, which I believe is titled something like First Visit. I'm gonna have to double check that. I actually have that here somewhere. I just didn't pull it out for this video because simply I wanted to talk about this one because again the value element. So it's certainly one to keep an eye out for because it's so valuable. And if you're somebody who's interested in hearing some of this the stuff that was was sampled later and hear it in its original form, then that's great too. But for me, this isn't one of the strongest titles in the entire Muse catalog. If you're buying to actually keep and actually enjoy, for me, I don't think it's worth the. I just don't think it's worth the going price. All right. By contrast, something that might be worth the going price, depending on who you are. So Catalyst is a really interesting band. They put out a couple of titles for Muse, and I think that this is the earliest one. So this one is simply titled Unity. I also have Perception here that I'll show you in just a second. So yeah, this is just fantastic stuff. I would say that Unity, this album, is a bit fusion, but also heavier on like jazz and funk. There's overdriven and even distorted electric guitar here. So that's kind of where some of the fusion sound, I think, sort of shows its face. The lineup here includes, let's see, so Zuri Tyrone Brown, Onaje Sherman Ferguson, Sanifu Eddie Green, and Walimu Odion Pope. In terms of the instrumentation, all the piano is electric. There are effects, like I said, not just the guitar, but there's effects otherwise. The flute is kind of like echoing. It feels overall like sort of a mysterious and very explorative album. And it's just really fantastic. I think that this is going to sound probably unlike anything else you've ever heard if you've been much more... If you've approached fusion from a jazz perspective, this is going to sound completely out of left field. If you approach fusion from a rock perspective, it might actually sound a little bit more comfortable to you, like you've heard some of these elements before. But because I'm more of a jazz guy, I just think that this thing is out there, but it's really exciting stuff. All right, so the next one by Catalyst is Perception. So this one has pretty much the same lineup, but they actually add Norman Harris and Jabali Billy Hart, as well as Pharrell Johnson on this one. I would say that this title, even in comparison to Unity, may even be more experimental, more sort of the sound effects, more electric, even acid-y. So if you're somebody who likes sort of that electric rock, acid kind of rock stuff that was going on during this time period, they just seem to really have absorbed a lot of that from a stylistic standpoint and incorporated it into this stuff that still feels more grounded in jazz to me. And I just think it's really exciting. Like I said, Catalyst is going to be one of those artists that if you're hearing it for the first time, it's just going to sound like unlike anything you've ever heard of, but just in a really, really good way. So this is a strong recommendation as well. Incidentally, and one of the things that just occurred to me is that a lot of these titles that I'm going to show you happen to be promo copies. And that's not a flex. What I wanted to point out is that out of any label that I can think of, you're going to come across promo copies of Muse like way more than any other label. They just seem, it's almost like there's as many promo copies out there as there are regular copies. So what I'm getting at is that if you're looking for some of this stuff on Discogs, it helps to follow or add to your want list both versions, because you'd be surprised at how many of these things come up as promo copies. And I don't think that there's a big price difference either between promo and standard, just because of how sort of ubiquitous they are. You're just going to come across promos, white label promos for Muse, like all the freaking time. They must have done a great job sending out copies to radio stations or something to help promote some of these albums. All right, so the next one that's definitely in the most valuable category, but also one that's just taken a huge jump since the pandemic, and that is Joe Chambers, the Almoravid, maybe? I don't know how to pronounce that. So about this album, okay, so I think part of the reason why it's so valuable and it's become more and more valuable is because of Joe Chambers, right? So Joe Chambers is synonymous with post-bop, played a lot with Bobby Hutcherson on Blue Note. He composed a lot of stuff that others were playing on Blue Note, and so there's just a lot of deserved attention on Joe Chambers, I think, at the moment. So on this album, you have Richard Davis, Ray Mantilla, David Friedman, Cedar Walton, George Cables, Harold Vick, Garnett Brown, Woody Shaw, Omar Clay, Doug Hawthorne, and Walter Booker. But I know it's a big group, but it's in a variety of formats, so they're not all on every track. I would call this stuff like heady, experimental, definitely post-bop. There's a ton of drum work here, and that's going to make sense because the drummer, Joe Chambers is a drummer, but a lot of extended solos, and just a lot of opportunities for Joe Chambers to showcase his instrument. To the extent that there's melody here, and there is, it's often played by marimba, and we know that Joe Chambers was comfortable playing with vibraphonists and marimba players, and so that kind of makes sense. But you also have horns on here, and the horns are used overall less for melody and more for solos, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. But this is just it's a phenomenal record. It's one that a couple of years ago you could get for $20 and now seems to go for $100 to $200. So it's gotten up there as well. But I mean, it's definitely one worth looking out for. And I think what you're hearing from me thus far in this little discussion that we're talking about the most valuable stuff is The stuff that's the most valuable is a little bit more of the stuff that's the most out there. The stuff that's not your traditional like hard bop or even post bop stuff. It's stuff that's like more explorative. And I think that that's interesting because if it means that more and more people are going to that type of music. It means that there's going to be more attention on some of the more explorative stuff. Do I think that everybody's going to be buying free jazz and all that's going to go sky high through the roof? No, but it does mean that I think people's tastes are a little bit evolving, I think, away from the traditional hard bop stuff. All right, so the next one up is Woody Shaw's The Moon Train. This is a phenomenal record. This one might be my favorite out of these ones that I'm talking about in terms of this most valuable selection. I forget who it was recently. It might have been on the Jazz Bums like Friday night live stream. I think it was, where they said that Woody Shaw really is having a year, and that seems to be the case. And I think part of it is it's combination, right, of that great title that was put out by Jazz Dispensary this year, the reissued one, and hopefully some more reissues in the future. And I personally think that Moon Train would be just like a top example of something they definitely need to reissue. I don't think they have lately. I'd have to double check that. So what about this thing? You've got Buster Williams, Tony Waters, Victor Lewis, Guillermo Franco, Onaje Allen Gumbs, Azar Lawrence, Steve Turr. I think that's it. Is that it? Yeah. So what I would say here is that there's more focus here comparatively compared to the other ones that we've gone through on denser orchestrated melodies. And I think that that's a little bit of just Woody Shaw's style with composition, where he wanted to insert that stuff. He wasn't necessarily just going to go right into like these kind of post-bop, amazing solos. He liked to establish his pieces in a much more structured way than a lot of the titles that we've just gone through. And so I think how that materializes here is that it has a little bit more of hard bop elements to it, but there's certainly post bop in style as well. I would say again that this is one of, if not Woody Shaw's best album, at least for me. I really, really like this thing. I think part of the reason is because, well, he's a trumpet player and I was a trumpet player, right? He definitely has amazing solos. His tone is absolutely gorgeous. It's smooth, but it doesn't have as much smoothness as, say, a Freddie Hubbard. But I also think that there's like understated elements here. So he's not the musician who needs to be in, front and center the entire time. There's some really great nuanced stuff, especially on the track Are They Only Dreams, which is track 2. There's some really nuanced stuff with like Cecil McBee's solo. I think it's on that track, or is it on Katrina Ballerina? In any event, this whole album is fantastic. It's well worth your time and energy to like go preview and try to find one of these things. And one other fun thing is that contrary to almost every other album cover, this one has this kind of like nice textured thing. I don't know if that's visible. One of those details, right? That if Kraft Recordings was going to put this out, they'd probably have to replicate that. All right, so the last one in this sort of most valuable category, and Woody Shaw is back here, although not as a leader. So it's Buster Williams' Pinnacle. I actually showed this record, I think, recently on my channel, but I had to include it since we're talking about Muse. So you've got Onaje Allen Gumbs on this one as well. You have Earl Turbinton, Billy Hart, Sonny Fortune, and Guillermo Franco, as well as Woody Shaw and Buster Williams. This one's very post-bop. It is explorative music, as a lot of post-bop is. There's moments where the rhythm just completely drops out or only does accents that aren't really meant to dictate the rhythm. And so in some ways, there's kind of like some freer sections, I think, that make this thing just unpredictable, really, really excellent. The drum work, I think, on this, in addition to Buster Williams' work, but the drum work is a huge highlight, absolutely amazing. And there's a lot of cymbal stuff that if you like listen for it, just nuanced and beautiful. This is one too that's just gone through the roof, I think, over the last couple of years. But you can still find a copy, especially if you have one that the cover's not in great shape like mine. But yeah, huge recommendation here. And again, the last one that I wanted to cover in terms of this kind of most valuable portion. All right, so the other side of the coin is the stuff that's not expensive, the stuff that you should be able to find pretty easily. And I want to be clear, this is not just Muse titles that happen to be cheap. These are great titles that are cheap, okay? So the first one that I wanted to talk about might actually be the cheapest. I think I spent $7 on this thing, and that is Link Chamberlain's A Place Within. So Link Chamberlain was a guitar player, maybe is, I'm not sure, but a guitar player. This stuff is pretty sparse. There's no piano here, okay? So you have Lynn Christie on bass, Dave Liebman on tenor and soprano, Bob Leonard on drums, and then Chamberlain on electric guitar. So there's no piano, and the only other, sort of horn again is Liebman. So therefore, it's a sparse record. I think that the inclusion of the sax is critical here because it adds that, I don't know, that kind of acoustic, more organic sound, I think that's really important on this thing. But for me, this album is just, it's much more nuanced. It's not as much in your face. It's not as much of these extremely impressive solos and a lot of energy. But I think this thing is fantastic. It was recorded in 1976, but I don't know. To me, the fact that this is only $7, I think, is absolutely insane. Because I think if for the right mood, I think this album just does a really great job. All right, so the next one is a Louis Hayes record, and not the first, not the only Louis Hayes title I'm going to show you, because I'm going to show you another one, not in this section, but later. So Louis Hayes is The Real Thing. This one's about $10, and when I say it's about $10, I bought this very copy at Academy in New York earlier this year for $10, and they had multiple copies of it, each for $10. So this one is definitely affordable, and I don't know why people skip over this thing, because I think the music's fantastic. So you have Stafford James here, Renee McLean, who's Jackie's son. You have Woody Shaw, Slide Hampton, and then Ronnie Matthews. I would call this hard bop overall. It is dense, which you'd expect from a drummer-led album. So there's a lot of drum work here, but you sort of have a really good mix, I think, of more energetic stuff as well as some ballads. Woody Shaw sounds particularly amazing here. I just think that I don't know if it's the cover that's deterred people, but if anything, just looking at that lineup and knowing the time period and everything, I mean, this is an easy pickup, I think. So yeah, this is just a strong recommendation, and again, $10. All right, so I wanted to add David Schneider into this discussion on Cheap Heat as well. And actually I have two here. So first up is Goliath, and I would say that this is also kind of in that $10 price point. It's possible, again, that people don't like this one simply because of the cover. Schneider's kind of doing, perhaps a little bit of a Prince style here, perhaps. So at this point for Muse Records, Rudy Van Gelder was actually doing a lot of the engineering. He was not early on, but he did later, like 1976, 77 and on. At least for a couple of years, he was doing a lot of the engineering. So on this thing, you do have Rudy Van Gelder as the engineer. In terms of the lineup, it's Cecil McBee, Hubert Eaves, Claudio Roditi, and Eddie Moore. This one is post-bop in style. I just find it really engaging. Schneider, I think, if I don't want to put the man down, I think if there's anything, here's the thing. He's obviously an expert player. He may not just have as much energy as maybe you'd want to hear from a saxophonist to really stand out more, perhaps. But that just wasn't his. It just wasn't his style, and I personally find there to be so much to enjoy both in this one as well as in the next one. So actually, to the point of the next one, let me just kind of move on to that. This one is titled "Thundering," and not as much the Prince vibe on this cover, but you also have Rudy Van Gelder as the engineer. On this one, it's Cecil McBee, Billy Hart, Guillermo Franco, Ted Dunbar, and Kenny Barron. And I would say that these two albums are similar in style. Both, again, $10. You should be able to find these pretty routinely. For some reason, David Schneider's stuff is just, it just seems ignored. And I think that, I think if you're interested in exploring something new, you want to hear great music, I think there's a lot of great things going on with this stuff. All right, so it just occurred to me that some of the titles that I've heard in digital form but that I don't own on vinyl are worth being inserted into this section as well. And so I do want to visit those really quickly, even though I don't have examples to show you. So I'll show you what the covers look like over here. So the first one is Bill Barron's, so Kenny Barron's brother, Bill Barron's Variations in Blue. This one has Jimmy Owens, Ben Riley, Ray Drummond, and Kenny Barron. And I would say that I think that this time period, so like late 70s and into the 80s, if you're listening to Muse Records, you're likely to get some throwbacks. And when I say throwback, I mean that later 60s, a little bit more hard bop influenced kind of sound. And that's not a criticism. It's just that some of these guys were revisiting some of those styles later on. And some of the time it was because they were musicians whose most active time period was in the 60s. And so they're kind of revisiting that material. So I would use that description to classify this Bill Barron title. And then the other one is Bill Hardman's Politely. So this one features Walter Bishop Jr., Paul Brown, Leroy Williams, Junior Cook, who's a just fantastic addition here. On this title, you also have Rudy Van Gelder as an engineer. And again, I would classify this one as a little bit of a throwback to that hard bop style. And I think that if you're looking at the early 80s catalog for Muse and you see a musician who you're like, hey, I know that musician because of they played on some Blue Note session or something, likely you're going to get a little bit more of the throwback. Walter Bishop Jr. is one of these guys who was around for so long and recorded a lot for Muse, both as a leader as well as in a supporting role. And he's one of those guys, though, that I think was doing both. I think he was doing some of the throwback stuff, but then he was also playing like more modern, like progressive kind of stuff. So anyway, just kind of just an interesting note, I thought, to point out with some of these later Muse titles. All right, so this next one that I want to bring up, back to titles that I actually have, Pat Martino's Consciousness. This one is fantastic. You can get it for between $10 and $15, and you're going to recognize some of the folks in the lineup because of the band Catalyst. So in the lineup, in addition to Pat Martino, you've got Tyrone Brown, Eddie Green, and Sherman Ferguson. So what I would say this is that if you're only familiar with Pat Martino's Prestige work, which by the way, I think is fantastic, this is much more explorative than you'd expect. And part of that is probably because of those guys from Catalyst that Pat Martino pulled in to play on this album. I personally think that out of the entire Muse catalog, in terms of like what is underrated and undervalued, this one may actually be at the very top of that list. It is really good. I think people discount it because I discount it as in ignore it, because it's Pat Martino and they just don't think he's like capable of being hip. But that is completely inaccurate. You have to listen to his stuff on Muse because he has a number of excellent titles, and I definitely make a point of checking the M section, looking for more Pat Martino stuff whenever I go to a record store. All right, so the last one that I want to talk about in this section on cheap heat may actually be pushing the boundaries maybe just a little bit in terms of what you call cheap, because this one's probably like $20 to $25. So it's still relatively inexpensive for an original copy. So this is Woody Shaw and Anthony Braxton's The Iron Men. The lineup here is Arthur Blythe, Cecil McBee, Joe Chambers, Muhal Richard Abrams, and Victor Lewis, in addition to those two leaders. The content here is a mix of originals and others' work, and those others include Eric Dolphy, Fats Waller, Andrew Hill. Then I think the rest of them are original. What I would say, especially with Anthony Braxton here in the lineup, is that there are some more avant-garde elements, but not nearly as many as you'd expect. I think that this music overall is fantastic, and keep in mind that I don't really like the stuff that's completely free of like rhythm and melody and chord progressions and stuff like that. So know that I don't generally like that stuff, but I'm a big fan of this one, and this may actually be my favorite title that has Anthony Braxton on it. I do like a number of his albums. I just I have to kind of be careful and know what I'm getting into, I think, with some of his work. So yeah, strong recommendation here. This one, I think it's possible that people are put off either by Braxton and the sort of music that he's known for playing, or they could be put off by the cover image, which admittedly is not as inspired. But I assure you, this is definitely worthwhile. It's worth your listen. All right, so let's move through the, I don't know, the other excellent titles section of this video. And I don't mean to, again, I don't mean to sort of discount these. I just wanted to cover, like, you know, here's some valuable stuff and what I think about it. Here's some cheap stuff that I think is definitely worth your time. And just here's the rest of you know, the highlights, I think, from the label. This stuff is just phenomenal. So let me first talk about Kenny Barron's Sunset to Dawn. So Kenny Barron has a number of excellent albums for Muse, and I think this is one of my favorites. This is from 1973. This stuff is trippy. It's cerebral. It's a mix of electric and acoustic instruments, heavy on percussion. There's a lot of fusion elements here. There's a lot of like not like natural sounds. It's kind of like organic sounding in terms of how they use some of the auxiliary percussion. The lineup is Kenny Barron, Bob Cranshaw, Freddie Waits, Richard Landrum, and Warren Smith on this thing. And again, this stuff is phenomenal. And if you're more familiar with Kenny Barron's more recent work, I think you're going to be really surprised at just how adventurous this title is. All right, the next one up, I only actually just got this one in recently, but I was certainly familiar with it from digital tracks. I had otherwise never owned a copy. So this is Louis Hayes' Breath of Life. So the lineup here is Tex Allen, Gerald Hayes, Charles Davis, Ronnie Matthews, David Williams, and billed as Toot Monk or T.S. Monk. This thing is experimental. It is spiritual jazz for sure. There's spontaneous group improvisation here. This thing is very different than the other Louis Hayes album that I showed you, which I think was titled The Real Thing. And I talked a little bit about how there's hard bop elements. This is much more progressive stuff and just super interesting. I think you get that vibe from looking at this fantastic cover, and it delivers. Like the music sounds like the cover looks. All right, so the next group that I want to talk about, they're billed as the Visitors. So the core part of the group is Earl and Carl Grubbs. They are brothers. They put out their first album titled Neptune. They actually put it out on Cobblestone. This is one of those titles that I mentioned, though, that was quickly reissued on Muse. And so that's the version that I have, is the Muse one. I'd love to get a Cobblestone one, but, you know, same music, right? So that was their first album. And then what they did is they put out a variety of albums. The only two that I have are In My Youth, which is fantastic. And then the other one is titled Rebirth, right here. So let's see. One kind of interesting fun fact here about Earl and Carl Grubbs are that John Coltrane's first wife is a cousin of the Grubbs. They were certainly influenced by John Coltrane, and in fact, on, I think it's Rebirth, or is it on? No, it's on In My Youth. They play a rendition of Giant Steps, which is really nice. I would say that their band and the style of their music is very much influenced by Pharoah Sanders in a variety of ways, both in terms of how the saxophone is used as an instrument and some of the effects that they get from it. The music is spiritual in style, but there's also some post-bop elements. There's like modal pieces here. There's everything about it. It feels like to me what Pharoah Sanders was doing with his band. It seems like these guys really absorbed it and incorporated it. And I do think that they added kind of different layers and took the music in a little bit different direction in some ways. They always surrounded themselves by phenomenal musicians, though. On these albums, you have Kenny Barron, Buster Williams, Sonny Morgan, Albert Heath. I'm trying to think who else might be added on some of these, because they did have some lineup changes across these three. But I think Stanley Clarke is on one of these. But anyway, all three of these are just fantastic. These are getting a little bit more and more expensive as the months go on, but I think you can still find these here and there and not have to spend, you know, more than say $40 or $50. All right, we're getting to the point now where I'm going to really go rapid fire, but I did just want to highlight one more musician in just a little bit more detail, because he had a number of albums that were great for Muse, and I want to make sure that I bring him up in particular. So Carlos Garnett is the guy I'm talking about. This is Let His Melody Ring On, and then this other title that I have here to show you is The New Love. He does have some others that I'm still looking for. So about Carlos Garnett, he was a Panamanian American. He incorporated, it feels like, a lot of his culture into his music. There are a lot of people on his albums. He also incorporates a string group on this one. I would say, I would call this music much more in the funk realm. There is some free jazz, there is spiritual, but I think it's more funk, and again, more of almost like his heritage, I think, that he brings into this. He does sing on this as well. There are some backup singers, but I think predominantly it's Carlos Garnett who is singing. But on the same tracks that he sings, he's also doing, he's a reedist, and he's also playing solos and stuff. So it isn't just purely, it's not just purely, vocals. I would say that if you're only familiar or you're used to listening to instrumental jazz, that this is going to be quite the experience, because it, like some of this other music, I think it sounds unlike anything else that you'd hear elsewhere. And I think that if you were listening to a Carlos Garnett track and you didn't know what was playing, you'd immediately be able to point out that it was Carlos Garnett. But yeah, he surrounds himself with a number of musicians who I'm not as familiar with, I got to be honest. So one thing I will say though about the New Love is that even though, like I said, he surrounds himself with a lot of musicians that I haven't heard of, on this one you do have Joe Bonner, and Joe Bonner himself has a couple of albums that are fantastic as a leader for Muse. You have Alphonse Mouzon, and then you also have, which I think is exciting, Tirumasa Hino, who plays on this thing and just adds quite a bit as well. All right, so the rest of these are a little bit rapid fire just to get through this, but I don't want to shortchange the video and not show you some of these ones, because I do want to leave you with something maybe new, something that you haven't heard before, a recommendation. So let me just kind of talk through these just super quick. So the next one I wanted to show you is another Woody Shaw record. So he has a number of titles for Muse, and I think all of them are worthwhile, I got to be honest. So this one is called Little Red's Fantasy. Ronnie Matthews, Stafford James, Eddie Moore, and Frank Strozier is in it. That one's fantastic. I just mentioned Joe Bonner. He has an album called Angel Eyes. This one is becoming more and more popular and therefore valuable, I would say, but very stark cover on this. You've got Linda Sharrock, Junie Booth, Billy Harper, Jimmy Hops, and Leroy Jenkins. This one was incidentally produced by Michael Kuskuna. Fantastic music there. I've talked about Richard Davis, I think, a little bit. He has a number of excellent albums, and one of his excellent albums is Harvest. So Ted Dunbar, Bill Lee, Consuela Moore, Freddie Waits, Billy Hart, Marvin Hannibal Pedersen, who's fantastic, and James Spaulding plays on that one. That one is super cool. Kenny Barron, Peruvian Blue. I mentioned this one, I think, up front. I forget why, but I did mention it early. And this is a great one. Ted Dunbar, David Williams, Richard Landrum, Sonny Morgan, and Albert Heath are on this one. So that's definitely one to look out for. Can't get enough of Woody Shaw. This is one that used to go for like 10 or 15 bucks just a couple of years ago, and now, gosh, it's like 75 or something. But it's easy to see why. Like, this one has a little bit of a, perhaps less inspired cover, although I think it's fantastic. But let's see, you have Steve Turr on here, Renee McLean, Billy Harper, Joe Bonner, Cecil McBee, Victor Lewis, Guillermo Franco, and Tony Waters. I absolutely love this record. I absolutely love it. It's just fantastic. What else? Albert Heath. So this one's titled Kwanzaa. So Jimmy Heath, Percy Heath join him, his brothers, right? Curtis Fuller, Ted Dunbar, and Kenny Barron. And how about that fantastic cover? Love this thing. And the last one that I wanted to show you is a little bit unusual because Harold Land didn't do that much for Muse, I don't think. This is one is titled, I can't even get it out of the shrink at the moment. Oh, here we are. It's called Susha's Dance. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So, Harold Land liked to surround himself with Bobby Hutcherson. And guess what? Bobby Hutcherson is here on this album, along with George Cable's Billy Higgins, Oscar Brashear, John Hurd, and Ray Armando. So even though this is a little bit later period for Harold Land, this is one to keep an eye out for, because anytime that he is joined by, well, here's the thing, anything that Harold Land did was fantastic, but especially the fact that he's joined by this crew and Bobby Hutcherson, this one's fantastic. And I still think you can get this for like 20 bucks. Maybe not, maybe it's closer to 30 or something, but this is definitely one to keep an eye out for. All right, so there you have it. Like I said, I hope people learned something. I hope people got a recommendation. I want recommendations though. So if there's a Muse title that you think I forgot that's your favorite, put it in the comments. Because believe it or not only do I read the comments, even if I don't always have time to respond to them, even though I want to, I always read the comments because I'm interested in recommendations, and I'm oftentimes like, as soon as I see something, I'm putting it into Discogs or Spotify or whatever, and trying to preview it. So that's how I learn about new stuff myself. So anyway, thanks everyone. Appreciate your attention, and I'll see you next time.